The photo was still warm from my phone's flash when I sent it. My daughter Sophie, 4 years old, lying in a hospital bed twice her size, a tube taped beneath her nose, a bandage running down the center of her tiny chest, where surgeons had spent 6 hours repairing a valve that should have formed correctly before she was even born. I sent that photo to the family group chat because for the first time in my life, I let myself believe my mother might actually show up for me. 90 seconds later, my phone buzzed. I remember exactly where I was standing, in the hallway outside the pediatric cardiac ICU, my husband's hand still gripping mine so hard my fingers had gone numb. I looked down expecting words of comfort. Instead, I read 7 words that I will never be able to unread as long as I live. Stop making her our problem. I read it twice, certain I had misunderstood, certain autocorrect had mangled something kinder into something cruel. But there was more beneath it. She wrote that she was tired of my emergencies becoming everyone else's emergencies, that she had her own life, that I needed to stop leaning on the family every time something went wrong, and that Sophie's surgery was, in her words, not something she signed up to be emotionally responsible for. My husband Mark read it over my shoulder and went completely silent, the kind of silence that is louder than shouting. I stood in that hallway with my daughter's blood pressure numbers still blinking on a monitor down the hall, and I felt something in me that had been bending for 34 years finally quietly snap. To understand how a mother could write those words to a daughter, standing outside a cardiac ICU, you have to understand the family I grew up in, because the group chat message wasn't an aberration. It was the truest sentence my mother had ever sent me. My name is Rachel Whitfield, and I grew up the older of 2 children in a house in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, where my mother, Diane, ruled the emotional weather of the household the way other people rule countries. My father died when I was 19, a heart attack at a construction site, sudden and final, and after that Diane became the sole trustee of a modest family trust my grandfather had set up decades earlier, funded by land he'd sold before he passed. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to matter, enough to pay for a wedding, enough to seed a business, enough, according to the trust documents my grandfather had written in his own careful hand, to cover, and I'm quoting the actual language here because it will matter later, medical and educational needs of the grantor's grandchildren and their descendants. I didn't think about that clause for years. I didn't need to. I had built a life that didn't require anyone's permission or anyone's money. My younger brother Trevor was different, and not because he was lazy or foolish, though there were seasons where both applied. Trevor was the son, and, in my mother's arithmetic, sons required investment while daughters required correction. When Trevor wanted to start a landscaping business at 23, my mother wired him $18,000 from the trust within a week. When his marriage fell apart 4 years later and he needed to rebuild, she sent more. When I, at 26, quietly working my way through a CPA license while waitressing nights, asked if there was any trust support available for continuing education, since the trust documents plainly listed educational needs as a covered category, my mother told me that the money was for people who actually needed it and that I had always been the responsible one and responsible people didn't ask. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting on my kitchen floor and deciding, right there, that I would never ask again, and I didn't. Not when Mark and I got married in a courthouse because we couldn't afford anything bigger. Not when we scraped together a down payment on a house that needed a new roof. Not once in 15 years, through 2 miscarriages before Sophie, through Mark's construction company nearly folding during a bad winter, through everything did I ask my mother for a single dollar. I built my own accounting practice from nothing. I learned to read financial statements the way other people read novels, cover to cover, looking for the sentence that doesn't fit. It is, in hindsight, a strange skill for a daughter who spent 30 years refusing to look too closely at her own family's books, because some part of me already suspected what I would find if I ever did. Sophie was born with a congenital defect called a coarctation of the aorta, with an accompanying valve abnormality, something the doctors caught on a routine scan when I was 7 months pregnant. We were told she would likely need surgery in early childhood, and we spent 4 years living with that knowledge, sitting quietly in the corner of every good day, the way you live with a smoke detector that occasionally beeps for no reason, and you just learn to breathe around it. When Sophie turned 4, her cardiologist told us the time had come. The surgery itself, praise every medical advancement of the last 3 decades, went well. It was the after that broke us open, the weeks of recovery, the specialists, the physical therapy Sophie would need for months, The fact that Mark had to take unpaid leave from his crew because someone needed to be with her every hour. The fact that our insurance covered the surgery but not nearly enough of the wraparound care. The fact that for the first time in 15 years of never asking anyone for anything, I looked at the mounting bills on my kitchen table and thought, quietly, desperately, maybe this is what family is actually for. That is the version of me who sent that photo. Not a woman looking for a handout. A woman standing in a hallway outside intensive care, hoping, one last time, that her mother might choose her. The days after that text message are hard to describe honestly, without sounding like I'm exaggerating for effect. So let me just tell you what happened plainly. I did not respond. I put my phone in my bag and I went back into Sophie's room and I held her hand while she slept. And something in my chest had gone very cold and very clear, the way water gets right before it freezes. Mark wanted to call my mother and confront her immediately. I told him no, not yet, because underneath the hurt, something else was stirring in me, something that had been dormant for 15 years of not asking, not looking, not questioning. I started thinking about that trust clause again. Medical and educational needs of the grantor's grandchildren. I started thinking about how many times over the years Trevor had mentioned, casually, offhandedly, at holiday dinners, sums of money that never quite lined up with what a landscaping business his size should have been generating. I started thinking about the fact that my mother had once, years ago, mentioned in passing that the trust balance was lower than expected because of market conditions in a year when the market had actually performed quite well. An accountant notices things like that. An accountant who has spent 15 years deliberately not looking notices them even more because the noticing has been building the whole time, quietly, in the back of her mind, waiting for a reason to come forward. 2 weeks after Sophie came home from the hospital, weak but stable, sleeping in a hospital bed we'd rented for our living room because she couldn't manage stairs yet, I drove to the county courthouse on my lunch break and requested a copy of my grandfather's trust filing, the one that had been recorded when the trust was established, along with the public probate records from when my father died and Diane had formally been appointed sole trustee. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't doing this out of vengeance yet. I was doing it because I am, by training and temperament, a person who checks the numbers when something doesn't add up, and my mother's text message had, for the first time in my adult life, given me permission to stop protecting her from my own scrutiny. What I found in those first documents was almost nothing, just structure, just the bones of the thing. But it told me two things that mattered enormously. First, that my grandfather had named a co-trustee alongside my mother, a family friend and retired attorney named Harold Voss, who was supposed to review and approve any distribution over $5,000, a safeguard my grandfather had built in specifically, according to a note in the file, because he worried that emotions could cloud financial judgment after he was gone. Second, that Harold Voss had resigned as co-trustee 11 years earlier, a fact my mother had never once mentioned to me or, as far as I could tell, to Trevor. I called Harold Voss. I want to tell you that finding him was some dramatic feat of detective work, but it wasn't. He was listed in the phone book, retired, living 40 minutes away, and when I called and introduced myself as Diane's daughter, there was a long pause on the other end of the line before he said, "Carefully, I wondered if one of you would ever call." We met at a diner 2 days later, and Harold Voss, 81 years old, sharp as anyone I have ever met, told me why he had resigned. He said that in the years after my father died, my mother had begun approving distributions to Trevor that he considered inappropriate, not illegal exactly. The trust language was broad enough to give her discretion, but ethically troubling. Loans that were never repaid and never actually documented as loans, transfers labeled as business investments that Harold suspected were being used to cover Trevor's personal debts, and, at one point, a divorce settlement. Harold said he raised concerns with my mother twice, formally, in writing, and both times she told him he was overstepping, that the trust was her responsibility as the surviving parent, and that his role was advisory only. When he threatened to bring his concerns to a judge, she suggested it would look very bad for a family friend to drag a grieving widow into probate court over disagreements about how she was raising and supporting her own children. He was 70 years old at the time and didn't want the fight. He resigned instead, quietly, and my mother never appointed a replacement, which under the terms of the original trust, Harold told me, she was legally required to do. She had been operating for 11 years as an improperly constituted sole trustee with no oversight whatsoever. I sat in that diner booth with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me and felt the last piece of a very old picture click into place. I thought about every year my mother had told me the trust wasn't for people who didn't need it. I thought about Sophie's medical bills sitting on my kitchen table. I thought about the specific language in my grandfather's own handwriting, medical and educational needs of the grandchildren, a category that, as far as I could now determine, had never once been used for me or for Sophie, not because we hadn't needed it, but because my mother had decided unilaterally, and for 11 unsupervised years, who deserved to need things and who didn't. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage. Not yet. It was something closer to grief. The specific grief of understanding that a lifetime of feeling like the responsible, unworthy daughter hadn't been a personality flaw of mine to fix. It had been a strategy deployed against me by someone who benefited every single time I chose not to ask for help. I didn't confront my mother right away. This is the part where I have to give credit to 15 years of professional training, because everything in me wanted to call her that night and read her the trust language line by line. Instead, I did what I do for a living. I built a file. I requested bank records for the trust account through the discovery process, available to any beneficiary under Ohio law, which took several months of patient, unglamorous paperwork. I compiled every distribution over the previous 11 years, cross-referenced them against the dates Trevor's businesses opened, closed, and reopened under new names, against the date of his divorce settlement, against a boat he had purchased and later claimed on social media was a work vehicle for his landscaping company, despite having no commercial registration. I compiled every instance where I could document that my mother had been asked directly for support towards Sophie's medical needs, including, now, a screenshot of a text message that read, in her own words, "Stop making her our problem," timestamped the exact night of my daughter's open-heart surgery. I hired an attorney who specialized in trust and probate litigation, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priya Anand who looked one at my file after our first meeting and said, "This isn't really a case. This is a formality. The only question is whether your mother settles quietly or forces us into a courtroom." I told her I wanted my mother to have every opportunity to do the right thing first. Priya looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's your call. But I want you to know that generosity like that is not something the evidence requires of you." I remember that sentence staying with me for a long time. We requested a formal accounting, the legal mechanism by which any trust beneficiary can compel a trustee to produce a full record of every transaction, and we sent it to my mother with a letter from Priya's firm rather than a phone call from me, because I had learned finally that some conversations should not happen through the channel where you are most vulnerable. My mother called me the day she received it, and her voice on the phone was not the voice from the group chat. It was quieter, more careful, laced with something I hadn't heard from her before, which was fear. She asked why I was doing this to the family. I told her I wasn't doing anything to the family. I was asking a trustee to account for trust funds, which was a right every beneficiary had, and which she would know if she had ever actually read the document she'd been operating under for 11 years, without oversight. She told me Trevor's business had struggled, that he needed the help more than I did, that I had always managed to land on my feet. I told her that landing on my feet had cost me 2 unpaid maternity stretches, a house with a leaking roof for 6 years, and a daughter recovering from open-heart surgery, whose care I was financing on a payment plan. While my brother drove a boat he called a work vehicle. There was a long silence, and then she said the thing that, more than anything else in this entire story, told me I had made the right decision. She said, "You were always going to be fine, Rachel. You've never needed anyone." I told her that not needing anyone and not being needed by anyone are two very different things, and that she had spent 30 years mistaking the first for permission to withhold the second. The accounting, once it was finally produced under legal compulsion, was worse than even Harold Voss had suspected. Over 11 years, Trevor had received just under $210,000 in distributions from the trust, the overwhelming majority undocumented as to purpose beyond vague labels like business support or family assistance. My share, over the same 11 years, was $4,000, a single distribution my mother had authorized the year I got married, framed at the time as a wedding gift rather than a trust distribution, which meant that in 11 years, not 1 cent of trust money had ever been directed toward a documented medical or educational need for me or for Sophie, despite my grandfather's trust existing, in his own written words, specifically for that purpose. Priya filed a petition in probate court, requesting my mother's removal as trustee, the appointment of an independent professional trustee in her place, and restitution to the trust corpus for the undocumented distributions, along with a specific request that Sophie's outstanding medical expenses be reimbursed directly from trust funds under the plain language of the founding document. The hearing was scheduled for a gray morning in late October, and I want to tell you that I walked into that courtroom feeling triumphant. But the truth is, I felt sick to my stomach the entire drive there, because some childish, stubborn part of me still wanted my mother to stand up before the judge and say something that would make all of this unnecessary. She didn't. She arrived with an attorney of her own, a man who spent the first 20 minutes attempting to argue that the trust language was ambiguous enough to justify her discretion, an argument that collapsed almost immediately once Priya introduced Harold Voss as a witness. Harold testified calmly, precisely, about his resignation, about the warnings he had given in writing 11 years earlier, about the trust's explicit requirement that a co-trustee be appointed in his absence, a requirement my mother had simply ignored for over a decade. Then Priya introduced the accounting itself, walking the judge through distribution after distribution, and I watched my mother's attorney's expression change from confident to careful too. By the time Priya reached the boat, visibly resigned, the final piece of evidence Priya introduced was the screenshot, the text message, time-stamped the night of Sophie's surgery, entered into the record not for its cruelty, Priya was careful to say, but because it established, in my mother's own words, a direct and contemporaneous acknowledgement that she was aware of a covered medical need under the trust and had explicitly refused to consider it. The judge read the message silently at the bench for what felt like a very long time, and then looked up, not at my mother's attorney, but at my mother herself, and asked her directly whether she disputed having sent it. She said no. It was the only honest thing I heard her say all day. The judge ruled from the bench 2 weeks later, after receiving supplemental filings. My mother was removed as sole trustee, effective immediately, and a licensed fiduciary from a regional trust company was appointed in her place. The court ordered restitution of $85,000 to be repaid to the trust corpus over a structured timeline, offset in part against Trevor's expected future inheritance, and ordered a direct distribution of just over $31,000 to reimburse Sophie's documented medical expenses, the exact category my grandfather had written into the trust with his own hand decades before any of us were born. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't meant to be. What it was proof, entered into a public record, that the withholding had never been about need. It had been about who my mother had decided deserved things and who she had decided didn't, and a judge looking at 11 years of documentation had disagreed with her completely. I wish I could tell you the rest of the family closed ranks around justice the way it does in the stories that end neatly, but real families are messier than that. Trevor didn't speak to me for almost a year, furious that I had, in his words, blown up the family over money, though I noticed he never once disputed the accounting itself. My mother sent one email after the ruling, not an apology, but a long message about how she felt betrayed by her own daughter, about how families were supposed to protect each other from outsiders like judges and lawyers, about how I had made everything so public. I read it twice, and then I did something I had never once let myself do in 34 years. I didn't respond, and I didn't feel guilty about not responding. What did happen quietly in the months after was that my Aunt Carol, my mother's own younger sister, called me out of nowhere one evening and told me she'd watched my mother do a version of this for 30 years, favoring, withholding, deciding, and that she had never had the courage to say anything, because confronting Diane had always felt like more trouble than it was worth. She told me she was proud of me, and then she cried on the phone for a while, and I realized that my mother's control over the family narrative had never been as unanimous as it always felt from inside it. It had just been unopposed, which is a very different thing. And once it was opposed, once in a courtroom with documents, other people who had been quietly harmed for years finally found room to say so out loud. Sophie is 7 now. She has a scar down the center of her chest that she has decided, in the specific and marvelous logic of a 7-year-old, makes her a superhero, and I have stopped correcting her because I think she might actually be right. Her cardiologist cleared her for regular activity 18 months ago, and last spring she scored a goal in a rec league soccer game and looked over at the sideline to find me the way kids do, checking that I saw it, and I had, and I will never stop being grateful that I get to be the parent standing on that sideline. I think about the version of me who stood in a hospital hallway reading 7 words from my mother and felt something inside her freeze. And I don't think that woman knew in that moment that she was about to spend a year becoming someone stronger than she had ever let herself be. I used to think that being the responsible one, the one who never asked, the one who always managed, was a kind of quiet virtue. I understand now that it was a role I had been assigned, early and without my consent, by someone who benefited every time I played it well. I don't know if my mother and I will ever repair what broke that October in a courthouse, and there is a version of this story where that would devastate me. It doesn't anymore, not the way it used to, because somewhere between the hospital hallway and the courtroom, I learned the difference between a family you are owed honesty from and a role you have simply been performing for people who never intended to show up. I chose honesty. I chose the record. I chose my daughter every single time, and if that meant becoming, in my mother's words, someone who made her own family her problem, then I have never in my life been more at peace with a problem I was proud to claim.